on platform regulation. I've read all your contributions and I'm looking forward to hearing them. Really outstanding. It's also particularly rewarding that we also have representatives or participants from our regulators in South Africa, information regulator, and representatives of the competition authorities in Kenya. So from across our borders, which is very nice. And then I understand now from Harry that Harry's in Australia. So it's nice to welcome him as well from afar, from down under. Okay, let's get into the conversation. I believe that Jonathan has been in touch with each one of you to indicate how we're going to handle the presentations. About 5 minutes each. I'm going to start with Harry, and then Paul, then Alison and Lengiswe, Adano and Nanette, then Moletsi, and then Tando is the discussant. So Harry, over to you. Harry, I think you're muted.
Thanks, Rose. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to be discussing these weighty and I think increasingly existential issues for large amounts of our democratic functioning, particularly when it comes to the information sharing function of journalism and to the privacy and surveillance issues that many of us face in terms of platform and platform power. I'm going to talk today just very briefly about the specific Australian attempts to regulate and come to some kind of agreement, a very innovative and crafty agreement with two of the platforms, Facebook and Google, in terms of funding what was a steep decline in the fortunes of Australian news media, journalism, large and small. And essentially what was happening was across the world, we've seen more and more companies are shifting their advertising budgets to digital. They're wanting to use the targeting and the more precise measurements that digital platforms are able to provide so that they can reach audiences with much greater precision. And these micro-targeting strategies are based on huge data sets that Facebook, Google, and other platforms gather about us and are able to extrapolate into a very, very fine set of micro-targets. So based on our search information or based on what we've liked on Facebook, and in fact, based on a lot more than that, because Facebook in particular follows us around the web and sees where we go after we leave Facebook and is able to piece together what some people suggest is about 1,600 separate points of data about us, which enables them to say to advertisers that are looking to reach people who may be between 24 and 29 years old and are living in Cape Town and are male and are thinking of buying a second-hand car sometime in the next 6 months or something along those lines, and then put the advertisements just in front of those people. So by 2018, traditional advertising revenues were falling really fast, and digital advertising revenues in Australia were picking up really fast. But of every $100 that of new revenue that was going to online advertising, approximately $47 of that new $100 of money was going to Google, and Facebook was taking $24. So of every $100 of new money that was coming into journalism, only $29 were going to every single journalistic player in Australia. What the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, came up with was a very interesting set of findings. They held a series of hearings, a number of public inquiries, and they basically decided and declared that these companies, these platforms, have developed what they call substantial market player and power, and it caused an imbalance in the market. And what they basically said was that this imbalance need to be rectified. They didn't find any particularly egregious sets of behaviors that cause this imbalance. And as Rod Sims said, and it's a useful quote to just take a piece or two out of being big, Rod Sims was the redoubtable chair of the ACCC in Australia, recently retired just this last month. Being big, he said, was not a sin. Australian competition law does not prohibit a business from possessing substantial market power or using its efficiencies or skills to outperform its rivals. But the dominance held by each of Google and Facebook in certain markets does mean that their conduct has to be subject to particular scrutiny to identify whether it is creating competitive or consumer harm, which they concluded it was. This is particularly the case when the dominant businesses are vertically integrated, that is, present at multiple levels in the supply chain. So based on that logic, they came up with a very crafty plan, essentially, to say, we are putting a compulsory bargaining code on the table. We are saying that you need to go and work out deals with every journalistic operation, news operation in Australia, large and small. There were certain criteria on what defined a news organization, certain turnover criteria, which was quite high. You needed to be making about 1.5 million Rand equivalent a year to qualify. And then Google and Facebook had to come and speak to you in order to compensate you for the harm that was done simply by the market power that they were wielding, no fault really of theirs in a sense. I mean, all their fault, but they weren't aiming to destroy the advertising base of journalism. That's just an unfortunate byproduct. But to rectify that, to come up with deals, and a year later, more than 30 deals have been struck. It's completely reinvigorated journalism here in Australia. They are deals for the licensing of that product, very reluctantly done by Google and Facebook, who fought back furiously about this. And it's injected between, nobody knows for sure, but the minimum level is estimated 100 million Australian dollars, which is R1 billion, into the news industry here. But some people believe it could be as close to 2.2 billion Rand, and that's in a country of 25 million people. So it's made a massive difference to newspapers, news organizations, websites, large and small. Everyone's hiring again for the first time in 10 years. The ABC, which is the equivalent to the SABC, is hiring. Local journalism is now starting to reappear, and there's a lot of the harm that these platforms cause to local information and news infrastructures have been reversed. It's all part of a bigger approach. I won't say much more about that now, but just to conclude by saying that it is time, as Terry Flew said recently at a conference, Professor Terry Flew is one of the experts on this, we can't rely on these companies to self-police and to regulate themselves, or do what he called very memorably regulation by public apology. Facebook always apologizes. We won't do that again, Cambridge Analytica, et cetera, and then they do it again. What we rather need is to shift from policy around platform governance and trying to kind of regulate internet and platform governance to what he calls a very firm digital platform regulation, where there are clearly enunciated laws, policies, and regulations combined, and this is critical, with enforceable sanctions for non-compliance. The big stick that the Australians wielded over Google and Facebook was really big and terrifying. Compulsory arbitration with unappealable deals to be struck by the ACCC if you didn't first enter into these voluntary deals. Of course, Google and Facebook entered into the voluntary deals because they didn't want to face that. So I'll leave it at that. It was very well put together by the Australian Competition Commission. It's been very successful. The UK and Canada are likely to roll out very similar models of this bargaining code, this compulsory bargaining code, and based on a very similar kind of jurisprudence or logic or philosophy of harm, rather than necessarily inordinate market power or doing something violating intellectual property laws or stealing people's news. None of that was the basis of this. It was all just on the harm done to the journalism infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks for that presentation, Harry. Can I ask Paul to make his presentation?
Thanks, Rose. Afternoon, everyone. This is a new community for me, so really happy to be here. Also sounds like there's going to be quite diverse presentations or talks this afternoon, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say.
Sorry, Paul, I forgot just to ask all of you to introduce yourselves as you say something about yourselves, because as you indicate, this is a new community, so introduce yourself, please.
Sure. So I'm from the Policy Action Network at the Human Sciences Research Council. We work on a handful of policy areas, actually, so everything from public health to local government, but also innovation, 4IR, and most recently in the AI space. So have some broad interest in the digital kind of economy arena, but not so much from a competition perspective. So that's why I think perhaps what I have to say is slightly different to what's normally discussed. But yeah, I'm interested in seeing what others have to say and what comments there might be. So my perspective really is going to look at links between competition and digital economy and industrial policy. And that mainly arises from a section in the Competition Commission report on digital economy that suggested industrial policy has a role to play in enabling a more competitive and inclusive digital economy. So that includes instruments like data policies, fiscal incentives, public procurement, and then grants, R&D investment, and the like. But there's also, I suppose, a parallel emerging interest in what's being called entrepreneurial state, especially with respect to a competitive digital economy. So the focus of my contribution was really around what capacity and legitimacy South Africa's entrepreneurial, developmental, or other form of state has to fulfill some of these industrial policy expectations, as well as just to explore some of the possible links to competition, regulation, and institutions. So it's really just to explore a number of questions in that space. By no means done in-depth research in this area, but I think there's some emerging questions that are starting to come through that are potentially interesting. And really it was, from my perspective, is really three broad areas where we're seeing some policy activity or policy proposals that are quite interesting. The one is around data as a strategically managed resource from a government perspective, and many of those on the call will be familiar with the draft data and cloud policy, which I think crystallizes a number of those ideas into quite tangible form. And then I suppose more kind of established initiatives such as the public-private partnerships around the use of identity and biometric data. And I suppose from a government capacity legitimacy perspective, they clearly have control over significant data assets that could be leveraged, but clearly there's some issues with legitimacy around the legitimacy as a custodian of that personal or sensitive data, particularly when it becomes financialized or commercialized in some way through those partnerships. And of course, there's a limited IT capacity in government, which is a major challenge. At the same time, there do seem to be opportunities for building on what is relatively strong capabilities, especially in the research data management space, on kind of transcontinental projects in research data, especially in health, that potentially could be built on, as well as quite pioneering work around data ethics and law. Probably a bigger gap from a government perspective, government capacity perspective, is then around capacity for contracting around data projects, as well as ethical governance of data in, for example, target sectors like health, and transparency around the processing of data in those areas. So potentially interesting from a competition link perspective is where competition authorities, I think, can support, I suppose, government, the executive kind of work or initiatives in the space from an industrial policy perspective, and that might be complementary, is clarifying rules around cross-border transfers of data by platform companies with information regulator, possibly in priority and kind of industrial sectors in inverted commas, such as health, and then also supporting competition in cloud services, whether by international, local cloud providers, infrastructure providers, and supporting innovation at kind of higher levels of the digital economy. Then broadly in the second area, I'm not going to go into these in much detail, but broadly as a kind of second big areas around demand side instruments, and that includes things like pre-commercial procurement by government, kind of early stage technologies, as well as preferential procurement and enforcing open access to support access to digital supply chains. Again, government capacity to enforce interconnection localization has traditionally been quite weak. Pre-commercial procurement is often very complex for supply chain managers to deal with, and that's where potentially capacity building can take place, or even partnerships can support. Partnerships, especially with intermediary institutions, could support kind of this pre-commercial procurement. And again, from a competition perspective, I think it's quite well known as potentially supporting those requirements and enforcing localization. It might be through a more kind of industrial type approach, industrial policy type approach, with kind of funding incubators of small digital enterprises. But I think more broadly and perhaps more interestingly is around open access to platforms when those deployed, including when those are deployed into government environments. We have traditionally large vendors implementing a government solution, and how do smaller local enterprises get access to those platforms or build their apps and services around those platforms. And then the third area was around more of a system view on governance, and that's really about connecting across government departments and with the private sector. And I think part of the challenge there is just the kind of disconnect between government and what's happening in the market, and understanding what the needs are like from a private sector perspective and the limitations on those partnerships. So I think I'll leave it there. I can go into more when we go to questions.
Thanks, Paul. So the next presentation, Alison and Lengiswe, I'm not sure who's going to do it, but please introduce yourself and then your co-author, if you like, co-contributor. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Alison Tilley. I'm an attorney. I'm a part-time member of the information regulator. I'm joined on the call by Ms. Shalembe, who is also with the regulator, and Ms. Chapole. Everybody's experiencing load shedding issues, so we'll just bat on and see how we do. But if I disappear suddenly, that might be the reason. We wanted to just comment on the issue around data protection and its role in dealing with big tech. I think it's true to say that we're part of a development of data protection laws across the continent. So, there, as at last count, 27 countries that have personal information protection and privacy laws, and many of them have other legislation which also deals with personal information, and quite a lot of the more recent ones are based on or very similar in general strategy as the GDPR. The introduction of the powers of the regulator in South Africa is a relatively new thing, in that the regulator only took its mandate on in July of last year. the regulator has a range of powers, but perhaps most useful here is just to mention that the regulator monitors and enforces compliance with the provisions of POPI. The regulator is empowered to do assessments on its own initiative, or when requested to do so on a public or private body in respect of the processing of personal information. We can monitor the use of unique identifiers, and we can also, look at the 8 conditions of lawful processing. So I won't go through them except to say that the questions around openness, I think, are particularly interesting because people need to know how their information is being processed, and I think that's always one of the mysteries with big tech, is that it's all in a black box, and we're obviously looking to understand better how it is that they are using personal information. There are 2 cases or engagements ongoing, which I thought I might touch on. The one is the current investigation into WhatsApp. That's an own assessment, as I said, in line with Section 40. So we can monitor and enforce compliance without an actual complaint. In this case, it was triggered by WhatsApp advising its users that it was updating its privacy policy in a way which really drew attention to the fact that there are sort of 2 categories of WhatsApp users, one which has more protection and one less. I think it's a rather brutal simplification of it, but what we are really interested in is why we as South Africans and frankly we as Africans don't have the kinds of protections that exist in the GDPR, when a lot of our legislation is in fact based on the GDPR, and we think offers similar or better protections to privacy. So I think that's really the question for WhatsApp is, are they complying with those sections? I think the part of the issue in trying to regulate big tech is really the question about the business model that they use and how it works. And I've said transparency is really important in this. So there is an ongoing investigation, so I can't really talk about it in much more detail. But I think that is certainly one example of, an African regulator taking on big tech. Just in relation to the regulator's mandate and the intersection between our mandate and the Competition Commission's mandate, we think it's an increasingly important intersection. There are overlaps between the 2 categories of law in the digital economy. Competition laws tend to support free access to data and freedom for different players to use data, whereas protection of personal information is really looking at the containment and protection of data. And I mean, I'm not suggesting these 2 necessarily contradict each other, but I think we've really identified a close working relationship between the 2 regulators is really important to make sure that both mandates are delivered on. The regulator and commission have established an MOU, and that was signed last year. And the idea is that we will continue to try and coordinate the exercise of our jurisdictional powers when making decisions, try to apply a consistent interpretation and application of the principles of competition law and privacy law. promote cooperation and consult each other timeously, give each other information timeously, in order to ensure that both our mandates are respected and dealt with. So I would say in summary that we are, I think, all on this, all the same, the paths all lead to the same place, I think, which is a recognition that big data it's causing difficulties, it's causing infringements of rights. At the same time, it's allowing you to, effect rights and enforce rights, and it's finding the spaces where really the human rights mandate, which is to protect privacy, has to be respected, protected, promoted, and fulfilled, to coin a phrase. I think that's all I have to say right now, but obviously we'd be open to questions as we go along.
Thank you, Alison. Can I ask Adono, all the way from Kenya, to make the presentation on behalf of the Competition Authority in Kenya? I'm assuming that, Adono, you're going to be doing it. Welcome. Good afternoon. Really exciting to have you participate.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all. My name is Dano Ario. I work with the Competition Authority of Kenya, dealing with issues of research and policy in the authority. On this article, I author with my colleague, Ninette Morania, who is also in the same research and policy department. This afternoon, I'll share with you our thoughts from a competition perspective, the relevance of data protection for consumer welfare and competition enforcement. What we have seen in the recent part is the growing importance of data, but also there are opportunities and challenges that comes that seems to affect competition enforcement as well. So what seems to be clear is that the traditional way of competition enforcement and consumer welfare, we need to be rethought, and that's our starting point. In particular, we have seen that there is growing importance of digital services and digital platforms to the extent that they affect the economies as a whole. And in particular for Kenya, we have seen that digital economy contributes about 7.7% of our national GDP. In addition, we have seen the growth of service industry in the recent years. And more particularly, we have also seen that leveraging on technology, insurance companies using data to profile consumers. And in most cases, this goes without their knowledge. This might also affect consumers to the extent that players or insurance companies, for example, might use collusive practices to use consumer data and affect competition in the market in that particular sector. In response, we have also seen that recently World Bank report shows that data and consumer issues are extremely important to competition enforcement, and therefore there's a need to rethink how privacy can be handled in the landscape of competition enforcement. So innovations in this platform might also constrain startups if proper enforcement is not in place. And in most cases, this is not the case. So the interaction between consumer welfare, competition enforcement, and privacy needs to be rethought in this case. And in particular in Kenya, what we have seen is that the government has enacted digital economy blueprint, as well as Data Protection Act in 2019. These two are very relevant for competition enforcement in Kenya. In addition, what we have also seen is that competition in Kenyan landscape also supports consumer welfare. So the authority has dual mandate for both competition enforcement and consumer protection. And competition law provides for confidentiality for certain businesses to the extent that that information might be sensitive for businesses in dealing with their activities. Therefore, there's a need to examine similar provisions for protection and confidentiality and data protection, which we do find actually there's similar clauses in both competition law and Data Protection Act. What we have also seen or observed in the recent past, particularly in the digital app-based taxis and also in the digital credit, there is multi-honing where players or users, like even drivers of taxis, are able to switch between different platforms, and therefore provides users or platform owners opportunity for integrating data of clients or consumers for that matter, and how this is affect their business is key, the operation. However, it is not in the knowledge of consumers how this data is used because of the gap in legislation so far. We do see also that from mobile network operators, they accumulate a lot of consumer data, which to a large extent provide multiple products in a very innovative way without really consumers having rights on how this data is also used. In addition, also in terms of competition and also to break barriers between different players, we have seen interoperability between different operators in terms of how they use consumer. Yet, once consumers register with certain platforms, they are locked in, where increased innovation might be of benefit, but the use of consumer and how this is affecting their use of data is not very clear again. What we have seen also in digital credit platform is the fact that borrowers are able to use different platforms for borrowing on credit based on emergencies or different uses. However, how this data is put together by different players and used for competition enforcement and raise consumer concerns and privacy concerns are not clearly spelled out in the laws that exist in the country. Therefore, what we have tried to do in this small contribution or brief contribution is to look at the inadequacies in terms of privacy law enforcement and consumer, as well as privacy law provisions and also privacy law in terms of inadequacies in determining how data can detriment consumers and also even cause consumer harm. So therefore, our main aim was to look at digital platforms and how data affects or inadequacies in different laws, how data affect consumer welfare. On the benefit side, I think we also see that from a law perspective, the Kenyan Information and Communication Act is able to show that data, information and communication fall under the same authority or the same entity. Therefore, there's an opportunity for institution to provide a relevant, useful engagement so as to provide relevant consumer welfare in a way that affects consumers, and also working together might be more beneficial as opposed to entities working in their own space. Therefore, what we do see, even at the regional level, where competition agencies explore issues of cross-border effects, there is need for agencies to collaborate, and therefore multi-dimensional, multi-jurisdictional boundaries becomes very important, both for competition enforcement and data protection. Therefore, in there, we do see both at national level from a competition perspective and at the regional level, there's a very clear intersection between competition law enforcement and data protection based on huge amount of data that competition agencies collect, may it be for cartel enforcement, investigation, research. All this data is within the jurisdiction of competition agencies. Therefore, how can competition agencies make use of this data in the presence of Data Protection Act? What we see from this is that there's an obvious overlap between competition enforcement and data protection, but the cooperation framework that might be required for benefit of consumers and also data protection might not be in place as of now. In terms of the way forward, looking at the different laws and jurisdictions, what we see is that there is need for efficient competition law enforcement to take place. We need to look at how agencies can work together or even be put under one umbrella in terms of enforcing competition and also data protection, or a very clear way of working together in a way that is mutually beneficial for both competition enforcement and data protection, as well as ultimately for the benefit of consumers. The other thing that we see as the way forward is in the current drafting, the law does not provide for a comprehensive or a binding way that these agencies can work together. There's a need to rethink how can competition enforcement and data protection work together in a way that is agreeable to the existing laws, or can another law be drafted which allows for this provision to be implemented by relevant agencies. And finally, what we do see as a way forward for competition enforcement and data protection, and also for the benefit of consumer, is to draft a sustainable cooperation framework in the time of digital platforms, and also for the mutual benefit of all agencies, in order to deliver on their services and also for benefit of the consumers. And I think that's what we see as a way moving forward that will benefit competition law enforcement, even in the wake of times when they have a lot of data, and data protection laws should not restrain competition laws in terms of how they use data, or even how they obtain data for functions or mandates such as data inquiry or even research that will inform policy and also government agenda reforms. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dano. Very, very interesting again. Tlalefang, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Most welcome. Please take the floor.
Thank you so much. My name is Tlalefang Moeleti, and I'm a student at Wits, and I'm also a consultant, digital economy, private sector consultant at the World Bank. And the digital economy became a key focus of the World Bank's agenda in recent years. And there's been a number of studies that the bank was doing in this area that I was fortunate enough to participate in. So my contribution today, I just wanted to share some of the emerging highlights that we have from our studies. So the first big study that we did was South Africa's digital economy diagnostic. We were looking at the 5 different pillars of South Africa's digital economy, being digital infrastructure, digital skills, digital entrepreneurship, digital public platforms, and digital private platforms. And then at the end of that study, related to digital entrepreneurship and digital private platforms, we realized that there wasn't a lot in terms of data and in terms of evidence that we had about what is happening on the ground. So following on that study, we then did a digital platform study, which will soon be published, where we try to narrow in on some of the real evidence of what the impact that platforms have had on the South African economy. So we mapped over 200 active digital platforms in South Africa and tried to understand who they were, where they were headquartered, what sectors they were in, what objectives they had, and what traction they had. And some of our findings are unsurprising. So for instance, we saw that among these 200 digital platforms, most of them were founded in South Africa, were established and headquartered in South Africa. But the ones that had the biggest traction were platforms that were foreign. And then we also saw that South African platforms were trying to offer a service around niches, around maybe market gaps, that digital platforms that are large and transnational weren't failing because maybe it's too complex to fill them, or maybe they don't have the local knowledge in terms of how you would navigate that particular segment or space. The other interesting finding that we had was most of the platforms in South Africa were in e-commerce. So e-commerce, fintech, travel tech, gig economy, and property tech were the 5 most represented subcategories. And e-commerce was the largest by far, up to 55–60% of all digital platforms were in e-commerce. And then one of our other findings was that there's around 30,000 platform workers in South Africa. So we are seeing, you know, though still nice and still maybe growing, we're starting to see a bit of an impact in terms of job creation. But of course, there's another debate in terms of what kinds of jobs are these, vulnerabilities of platform workers, some of which were exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, like I mentioned, most of the platforms are started in South Africa, and then United States, Europe, China, and Africa, rest of Africa, are the other sources of the digital platforms that are active in South Africa. And then some of the, to finish off, some of the key challenges and opportunities that we've highlighted in our assessments is just domestic, starting with challenges, domestic market fragmentation in South Africa. That is sometimes linked to, you know, like the structural issues that we have in terms of skills and infrastructure and the digital divide. And what we found with this is that this was particularly a key constraint for local platforms that were trying to service some of the underserved communities, because scale and critical mass are really, really important for digital platforms. And from our research, we saw that several of them had initial traction, but you know, they were really struggling to achieve that critical mass. And then foreign international platforms were a key concern, and this is one of the things that has informed the market inquiry that the Competition Commission is currently doing, in terms of to what extent they distribute value away from low and middle income countries and displaced local in industries, and maybe have some anti-competitive market outcomes. So we tried as best as we could to fill in the data gaps, but a lot of our evidence was you know, disaggregated, and a lot of it was anecdotal. So we still see a gap in terms of collating and collecting information around this. And some of the discussions we've had was, what does this mean, for instance, the way that we do labor market for surveys? And then finally, the key opportunities that we identified were reducing market frictions and trying to allow these platforms to really create proper income opportunities for many maybe mid-skilled workers, even low-skilled workers, and then also trying to understand how we can increase the market size so that you know, these platforms can enable SMMEs to better benefit from the promise of the digital economy. So yeah, those are my contributions for now. I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tando, over to you now as the discussant. Thank you.
Thanks, Firoz. Thanks, colleagues. Good, I'm not going to say afternoon, good day, everyone, given that everyone is in different parts of the world. My name is Tando Vilagazi. I am the director of the Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg. My remarks will very much be kind of in my own kind of personal capacity, reflecting on the written submissions and that as well, and the discussion that's come up so far. somewhat unusefully will perhaps throw more questions back into the pot for the discussion than try to move us forward in any way. So apologies for that in advance. I see some interest, and I'll try to cover these in kind of a few focus points, perhaps 6 or 7. I think there's a very interesting kind of convergence in some areas in terms of the way we're engaging with the issue of digital markets and digital platforms in the context of developing countries broadly, South Africa in particular, and African countries, in that whereas initially there was kind of quite some reticence or uncertainty about whether and how authorities were to start thinking about engaging a Facebook or a Meta as it related to their impact or the impact of various of their practices on African countries and markets, and particularly a lot of this was happening in the competition law space. I think it's now well established, and perhaps this flows from some of the big reports, the Furman Commission report, the Australian Commission's approach, the approach in Germany, India, etc., that there is probably quite a significant role for kind of, I think what the Furman report calls a ex-ante pro-competitive regulatory approach, or something to that effect, right? So essentially taking the view that there are opportunities as these markets develop, even though they're also quite developed already, to essentially shape the rules of the game in ways that prevent, particularly in developing countries or in nascent markets or growing markets, the kind of tipping or network effect related tipping that often occurs in these markets in ways that tend to be quite irreversible. At the heart of that, even though they reflect on it in the context of a kind of, I suppose, what you might say is orthodox competition law, industrial organization approaches, but really at the heart of their interventions is a very critical role for the state. And I think this comes up in different ways in the various papers that people have shared here today, right? Either in talking about the role of specific regulators or groups of regulators in coming together to structure interventions or draft regulations. But also, for instance, if you take the ACC example that Harry presents, which is really this interesting mix, I thought, of the competition regulator taking quite a technical stance in terms of working out what the precise kind of mechanism that was at play in the market that was leading to this loss of revenue in the media industry. But then I think quite fascinatingly, in terms of enforcing the thing and actually addressing it, the resolution, as it were, involving the national treasury, etc., is very much the state. It's a much bigger kind of intervention by government in view of citizen complaints and public concern around the issue. And to me, that says something quite interesting. It says that these issues are perhaps not well addressed only in the lens or through the lens of kind of competition law enforcement or consumer protection, right? Particularly when you're dealing with, in each of the instances referred to in the papers, very large kind of internationalized firms, right? Where there's very real issues around kind of relative holding or bargaining power, if you use a political settlements framework, or even just narrowly in the industrial organization literature when you talk about relative bargaining power. And here I'm trying to kind of really make reference to the fact that how do we think about the ability of states, governments, regulators, particularly in South Africa, in developing countries in Africa, to engage with the kind of highly resourced, highly sophisticated, and highly equipped kind of positions of the Googles, the Metas, etc. When we've been talking about these markets, right? It seems to me that a critical part of what happened in the Australia case, as Harry describes it, is the fact that the state, the citizens, and kind of there's a lot of public debate around this, had a very important weight in terms of allowing at least some kind of resolution, which is the bargaining approach, to be reached in that context. And I wonder if that tells us something about how important the role of the state will be in thinking about an Africa approach to these issues. But then the question is, well, is it possible to work around or with the kind of context of what you would say are weak or miscoordinated or resource-constrained governments in our environments? Suggesting here that perhaps it's not enough for us, and maybe pushing us further, to simply say this may be more difficult in African countries to have these types of interventions because there's questions of weak state capacity. Well, that might leave us exactly where we started, and I wonder whether there's some creative ways of thinking around what happens next. How do you do this even in the context, right, of weak, compromised states, in particular in South Africa, for instance. I think there's some important lessons that come from other areas, right? And this is to pick up on Adano's point here that, or at least the Kenyan case study, which I followed in terms of mobile money and that as well over the years, is that we do have instances where there's been lessons at least to be learned from of adaptive, responsive, agile state regulation and collaborative regulation, right? So as I recall in the Kenya instance, but also in Zimbabwe, when the issues of mobile money started to come through, many of them and the dimensions of how that market works weren't necessarily scripted in the existing banking or central bank regulations or whatever, or even in the telecoms regulations. But through the collaboration on piecemeal issues, as opposed to kind of revising all the policies in the country, on piecemeal issues, you had resolutions from directives from government at different points in time that allowed the regulator to enable these markets to keep evolving without stifling them, but B, to intervene where there were particular issues arising, like on agent exclusivity. Right? And I think these are important case studies. A second that we might think of in the context of a state, rather than seeking to do, and this is linked to the issues Paul raises, as opposed to essentially enabling, I suppose, to some extent, is when we think about South Africa's renewable energy power producers program, right? I've missed a P there, where essentially the trick, at least in our interpretation, the work we've done, is in understanding that the design of that bidding framework for others, for private sector, to do the necessary investments, for instance, in renewable energy in the country, came from how the program was designed. So the state essentially got, I mean, to put it quite crudely, other people to fund what we needed to do as a country in terms of investing in renewable energies, right? And that was an issue of incentives, design, and credible commitments from the state, not necessarily in terms of money, although arguably, of course, Eskom foots the bill in terms of paying for that electricity. But certainly in terms of getting the private sector to do the investments in ways that also opened up the generation space, right? And I think I've kind of butchered the example, but I think it's more to make the point that there's some important case studies on the table that might help us reflect then again on how to think about digital markets as they evolve as well. I wondered here, Adano, and I think others obviously that reflect on these issues from a kind of competition lens as well, whether there's more significant scope than we think for agencies of government and sector regulators to use the tools that are already in place or the knowledge that we know. So these are new markets and they're evolving quite fast, etc. But for instance, issues of interoperability or mandating, we would often do in competition resolutions or remedies, mandating access to what would otherwise be proprietary resources or assets through fair, what would usually be referred to as this kind of fair and reasonable non-discriminatory terms. Right? So proprietary, as I understand it, and I might be completely wrong here, but I'm not a lawyer, so it's great, doesn't necessarily mean that no one could ever use the resource, right? And so is there some creativity and kind of, well, it's certainly some lessons on the table that we can bring in here from what we already know to interpret and engage with this issue of how do we open up access to data? How do we open access, for instance, for SMMEs to leverage the data of a Facebook in South Africa or whatever it might be? As I understand it, there's some serious issues about the ability of smaller platforms, and I can think of one particular example here, that leverage the Facebook platform to link up businesses with consumers in South Africa, where they essentially say, well, the platform is really nice and consumers and service providers seem to like it, but we are limited in terms of our growth because we're limited by Facebook in terms of the level of disaggregation in the data that's produced on our own group that we can see and therefore leverage and build on to grow the business, right? So essentially the rules that Facebook places in that context on access to its data that it generates about your group are restrictive, right? And are restricting the growth in that instance of a particular SMME, right? And so there might be some low-hanging fruit, as it were, there that need to be engaged with. I think just a couple more points, Chair, that I thought just to throw into the pot. maybe just on the issues that Tlalifang raises, I think what was interesting in his work as well, and the work we're doing with him, is that it's starting to seem that the term SMME in the context of digital markets is a bit deceptive as well, right? Which we tend to use, for instance, in Paul's reference to kind of smaller businesses seeking to participate or engage with platforms or participate in competing with existing platforms. In the sense that some of the kind of, call it outsiders or complainants, as you were, or victims in the context of the Commission's market inquiry on platforms, for instance, are actually relatively large firms. The problem is that the big dogs, as it were, in the sector are really large firms, the Ubers, etc., Google and whatnot, right? But I suppose this is to make the point and link also to Harry's work on the Australia case, right? Is that I wonder how many of those 30 large media houses that have agreed agreements with Google and Facebook are actually our equivalent of a kind of Media 24 group, Naspers, etc., which are actually really large firms, well-resourced, but essentially dovetailing and leveraging this little window of opportunity that opened to get some concessions, right? I mean, the next level of work in this area, perhaps, for someone to do is also to think about, well, who gets the benefits from these types of settlements, right? If it's only 30 of the firms, for instance, in Australia that have started to reach these agreements, how representative is that 30 of the wider industry, right? Does that include or represent smaller emerging media outlets, etc., right? In my reading, for instance, of the criteria that's applied there for who gets to benefit from these arrangements, I think in footnote 10 of yours, Harry, suggests that if we took that same criteria and applied it in South Africa, it might be quite exclusionary in terms of when you cut up the relative sizes of businesses that could access it in South Africa as well. But lastly, I mean, Chair, I think I'll leave it there as well, but then throw in some other points as we go along as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Tando. So much that you have raised. So we only have about 15 minutes left, so I'm not going to say much except perhaps to raise the question, one theme that perhaps cuts across is these overlaps between different areas of law and regulation, including, economic regulation, and then questions of human rights enforcement, which forces us to think perhaps outside the box. And then there's questions that Dana was raising about collaboration across by regulators across jurisdictional boundaries and perhaps even across geographical boundaries. But let's open for questions and discussion. Please just show your hand and then unmute to put your question. I see Isaac.
Thank you very much. My name is Isaac Minar. I work in the area of access to information, media, digital rights, often for SANEF, but also other organizations. I would like to pick up on this exact point that you made now about the overlapping areas of specific economy and human rights. And use as a departure point the UNESCO position and work that they've done around news and information as a public good. And I would like to ask Alison Tilley in particular, with her hat with the PIA mandate of the information regulator on, meaning access to information and freedom of expression, what kind of support can the information regulator provide in ensuring fair coexistence between media, particularly credible, trusted media, and the tech platforms, and really the key issue here is how do we ensure universal access to trusted media online by the broad population, on the one hand, often through some of the big tech companies, but at the same time ensure the survival and sustainability of credible media. And I want to ask you to also maybe just touch on the relationship that they have with the Competition Commission and also with the network of African information regulators, and whether a continental approach should be followed to try and ensure credible media survival in Africa, and whether that may be a position to be able to negotiate from a position of strength with tech platforms. Thank you.
Thanks, Isaac. Happy to see you again. Okay, I wonder, this is a sort of big meaty question, which Harry also spoke to. So perhaps, Alison, we can have a little bit of an exchange on this big question, the impact of the digital these digital platforms on media freedom of expression, and I suppose the functioning of a democracy.
Thank you. Those are broad questions, but thank you. It's like, I think I'm very pleased to talk about the power mandate of the regulator, because I think what I've seen so far is a much greater use of an interest in poppy, and I have to say, I think that's largely driven by businesses who have, been in the business of promoting poppy, and also because a lot of compliance officers see it as part of a sort of compliance universe. What we haven't seen is anything like the same interest or attention in relation to PIA. And I think that it was always assumed that the media would use PIA extensively, and that the results would, really be the part of the news that is substantive and solid, because it would be, evidence-based journalism. It would be data journalism as well. And PIA doesn't just relate to paper records or PDFs. It relates to data sets as well. And we haven't seen anybody even think about that yet, it seems, from what's coming in. So I think there is an important role for the regulator to play, but it takes two to tango. And we're not having, we're not seeing that kind of use of the regulator and its powers. So I think that's very important. Certainly in relation to the African Network of Information Regulators, it's a relatively new institution which is setting itself up and getting underway. In relation to big tech, there's been a lot of interest in the South African inquiry into WhatsApp. So obviously many of the same issues apply in those jurisdictions. I'm not sure that I can say that there is there's not an absolutely direct link between what the regulator does and access to a trusted media. We still rely on the intermediaries, the journalists in this case, who have to take the information, often voluminous records, and turn it into news. And I think that in that regard, the thing that worries me is the question about the capacity of newsrooms at this point to deal with information at scale. I would think that it's certainly one of the things that I'd expected to see, and I haven't. And if it's like you have any thinking about why that is, I'd be very interested to hear that, because I think it is a critical part of the mandate. We certainly don't have, I would say, the mandate to do the kind of Facebook news inquiry that the Australian regulator did. That would be my view at this point, but you know, I might not be right in that regard. Thank you.
So does anybody ever thought about who would in South Africa?
I mean, would it not be the Competition Commission itself?
I was perhaps suggesting that. I don't know if Harry's got a view.
I think it would be the Competition Commission itself, and that's just because of the strategy and the logic and the thinking and the rationale behind what it is that is impacting on the ability of newsrooms to play their institutional role in keeping our democracies functional and keeping the information coming through to the public sphere so that people can deliberate, that people can have the information they need to make decisions, whether it's voting decisions and democratic decisions, or whether it's more substantial participatory decisions about how things should be. Our newsrooms are being dramatically reduced because of these shifts in essentially market power away from their business model, which is a multi-sided business model, but which has always been about aggregating audiences' attention and selling that. Now, Google and Facebook come in and they do that much better. They micro-target, they allow for the micro-targeting, and they allow for an overblown, but a promise of a much greater and more effective depth and reach, and an ability to really say whether your ad has worked, whether you've got in front of the right people making the right decisions. Now, they massively lie about that, and they exaggerate their success and their ability to do that. It's not anywhere as effective as they say it is, but it's effective enough to take 70–80% of all new spending on digital advertising away from the people who need it, who are providing the audiences. And the competition commissions around the world have focused on the so-called stealing of news, or the appropriation of intellectual property, the taking of content. And that was certainly the EU's approach, and the approach in Spain was around kind of copyright protection, paying for the use of news. And what's so interesting about what's happening in Australia is that these organizations, Facebook and Google, have said, oh, we never do that. That's not what happens. We just allow it to be shared, or we allow it to be searched. And that we are doing a great service to those organizations for that. We are not appropriating that intellectual property. The Australian approach and the competition approaches are, you know, that's a murky area. That's a difficult area, and we don't want to get into there. But what we do know is something very harmful is happening, and we can't allow that to happen. We can't have no journalism. Journalism is essential for democracy. So that kind of approach, where one focuses on the harms that are caused by market imbalances and by this very incredible market power, incredibly large market power that people have, and you come up with what is a big stick approach. This is a very, very big stick that they brought to bear, and they stood their ground in ways that the EU, I think, have really looked on enviously, because they weren't quite able to hold the line as the EU with Spain, and then with what happened in France, because they took a more intellectual property approach. So just to wrap up and conclude, I think it would be the competition authority. It would have to go on that kind of approach. And just to address the question of large and small, we mustn't be naive in not recognizing exactly how exclusionary it can be. It was set upon, it was set into motion by News Corp, the largest news corporation in the world, which has got 60% of the Australian news market. That's the Murdoch ultra-conservative news organization that is, you know, so powerful in the USA, in the UK, and in Australia, and a few other countries. But it has been extended to, for example, The Guardian has been a beneficiary, so has the ABC. So the fact that it was extended to the ABC, it wasn't initially that. The ABC had to fight really hard to say, hey, force Google and Facebook to also do a deal with us, because that's exactly what the regulatory state is doing. It's forcing them to do deals and saying, if you don't do a deal, we'll turn you into this thing called the designated organization, and we'll come and impose an unappealable deal on you. And we'll force you to share some of that, open up some of that black box with the people you're doing the deals with. A large thing of what Google and Facebook are doing, just to conclude, is paying money to avoid having their black box opened, because that's the other counter strategy I didn't talk a lot about from the market regulator, to saying, we'd like to see how your market distortion is actually working. So we'd love to see how your ad auctions, your automated ad auctions that you hold tens of thousands per second for Google AdWords or Facebook prominence, etc. We'd like to unpack that and understand your algorithms, and that's what we're going to make you do if you don't help us fix this hole that we've got in journalism's finance. And that's why they've coughed up a couple of $100 million, which is a tiny amount for them. They're going to pay more in the UK, and they're going to pay a lot more potentially in Canada. But even then, it's going to be just a drop in the ocean for them. But it's helping save journalism in Australia, and I'm hoping it can do the same in developing countries in Africa and in South Africa in particular. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're beginning to run out of time. It's 1:15. I wonder, okay, so what I'm going to do is ask Adano if he's got any thoughts about how this question that we've been discussing might be dealt with in Kenya. And then I'll see if there's still questions before we close the session. Adano, do you have any insights to add from a Kenyan perspective?
Yes, thank you very much. First, maybe I can make two brief comments. One is more on competition perspective. One is on the other one is on the data set. And I think for competition, what we have done with the coming into force of Data Protection Act is to give our opinion to the Data Commissioner in terms of we more formalize a mode of engagement that allows us to access the data along with the agreement, or they could exempt us in terms of the provision of the Data Protection Act that will allow us to enforce anything to do with competition law, also including data. Because one of the things that I think is more challenging now is assigning value to data. We do realize data is extremely important, especially in the digital economy and of course, particularly platforms, but there isn't value to it yet. So this is what is more challenging for competition law and competition enforcement. And therefore, what we have done so far with regard to data and platforms is whenever a merger comes up, what we do is we consider data. We don't give value to it, but we do give consideration outside, the traditional turnover and assets as a way of assessing a merger decisions. So that's what we have done. And also what we see as a more challenging, I think, from competition perspective with regard to data and competition enforcement is with regard to cartel enforcement, for example. How can competition agencies analyze data that resides with platforms, including retailers who use a lot of data, or big companies that are acquiring a small digital farm. So those are some of the things that I think which are more challenging for us. And we are aware of the fact that this is an ongoing discussions in other jurisdictions as well. And all the discussions, and I think also the amendment that has been made, they are all in the proposal stages. So this is, I think, work that we moving forward, we keep a close eye on and see how can we look at data issues for competition enforcement and consumer welfare. Thank you.
Thanks, Adano. So let me just see if there are questions there still are other questions. I'm sure there are many, but we do have a time constraint. So let's see if there are one or two questions that we can still extend the session and deal with. Are there? I don't see any yet. Okay. I want to thank all of you for your really thorough and extremely interesting work at the coalface as well as the cutting edge. I mean, these are really fundamentally important issues that we are addressing. And I look forward to further engagements with all of you, with this community, hopefully, that's interested in these questions, doing research. People like Adano who already have responsibility, Alison, for dealing with these questions as regulators. So scholars, regulators, researchers have a lot of work to do, and I look forward to, in that spirit, to further engagements with you all. Thanks again to all of you in Australia, in Kenya, and of course throughout South Africa. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much for having us. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
Paul. That was a great presentation, industrial policy, which we didn't get to discuss.